Hello, and welcome to our second edition of the Kylemore Book Club. A warm welcome to you all. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me, so if I can see some nodding heads, great. It's great to see you all, and I hope today we find you well and safe amidst these trying times. I'm really delighted that we're back on everybody's screen today for a very exciting session of our book club. My name is Lisa Caulfield, and I'm the director of the Notre Dame Global Center here in beautiful, iconic Connemara. I'm happy to report as the daily weather that it's actually quite magnificent today. And we were saying how it actually could possibly play a key into the poetry and to the work that we're reviewing today. So the background is not a false background. It's actually what it looks like today with the delicate play of light. So thank you to those of you who are returning today for the second installment. We're going to be meeting for this month of August, and I want to welcome those of you who have not participated before and are joining us for the first time today. Our purpose really here is to build community over the next few weeks and to engage with material that our professor has selected for the next 4 weeks. And hopefully together we'll feel some sort of revelation and insights in the context of our current situation and current climate, and perhaps learn a little bit more about Ireland and its authors in the process. The team and I are really humbled by the amount of interest that this program has generated, truly. We could not have guessed that this would have been the outcome at the start. To date, we have 710 registered participants in the book club from around the world. And we're really delighted that you've decided to engage with us on this ThinkND platform and to join us, whether it be for today, for just today, or for the next 4 weeks. We're just delighted to have your participation. So just quickly, I'd like to thank the sponsors or our co-sponsors for this book club, because really without them, we wouldn't have the kind of support that we have back at campus. So I'd like to thank Notre Dame International, the Keough Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, the Keough School of Global Affairs, Notre Dame Learning, and of course, the Notre Dame Alumni Association, of which so many of you who are participating today are proud members of. Just for the format for today, as is our tradition, we will have a 10-minute breakout session to discuss questions that our professor has outlined, and then this breakout will enable you to not only engage with the material, but meet other participants, as well as discuss today's topic and how it personally impacts you, as it would in any book club. Should you not wish to break out, you may stay in the main room until the group has had the opportunity to reflect and then be brought back in. So if you do not want to participate in a breakout session, you do not have to, and you can choose to stay in the main room. We also ask that if you have any questions for Professor Kiberd or any of our panelists today, that you use the Google form that we are now sharing with you virtually. We are asking you to use this form. It makes this easier for us to allow us to facilitate the questions and group them accordingly, and then we can return them to our panelists in a timely manner. So if you could please use the Google form to submit your questions, even from when you can't come back from the breakout session, that would be great. And we will try and answer as many of them as possible. Given the time constraint that we have, we are gonna be within the hour, so I just hope that we get to as many as we can. So if we don't, remember that we do have a LinkedIn discussion board that's moderated, and we can continue the discussion from today onwards. So, so please join the LinkedIn discussion board if you haven't already. Okay, so it is a distinct pleasure and honor for me to introduce to you all Professor Declan Kiberd. Declan is a faculty member who has given so generously of his time this summer for this lecture series and book club. Declan is one of the most distinguished literary scholars and literary critics of modern Ireland. He is a native of Dublin, And he is husband to Beth, and is the father of 3. And he has been a part of the Notre Dame faculty as the Donald and Marion Keogh Chair of Irish Studies and professor of English since 2011. And I would also like to welcome, on behalf of Professor Kiberd, our 2 distinguished guest panelists who too have so graciously shared of their time this evening, Deirdre Mulrooney and Evanna Lynch. Deirdre is a writer, filmmaker, radio documentarian, and dance historian. Her films include Lucia Joyce, A Full Capacity, which I hope you watched in advance of today, Dance Emergency, True North, and 1943, A Dance Odyssey. Mulrooney's books include Irish Moves and the Nomadic Work of Pina Bausch, which was her PhD. She is currently a UCD Arts and Humanities Creative Fellow. Welcome, Deirdre. And much excited in my household, Evanna, an actress, podcaster, and activist. Perhaps you've seen her portrayal of Luna Lovegood in the Harry Potter film series. I know I have, certainly countless times, as a result of my 3 young boys. She has, her most recent acting credits include a run of Enda Walsh's cult classic play Disco Pigs and Ryan Craig's Games for Lovers. She currently lives in London, where she spends her time writing and working to promote her animal rights and veganism. And so now, without further ado, I would like to call on Declan to introduce the topic that he chose for this series, Understanding the Body, and provide us an overview of this week's topic. Declan, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. And Deirdre and Evanna, thank you very much. I'm not going to say a lot because I want to hear all that you guys have to say on this topic, but I'll just repeat a few of the points I put out in the advanced material. People think of Yeats and Joyce as almost polar opposites. When the young Joyce went to visit Yeats to show him his poems, he suddenly pulled back and said, "Oh, it's too late, you're too old for me to help you," to a man who was still in his 30s and was probably the most famous poet in the language. And many people would think of Yeats as a believer in old-fashioned ideas of heroism and Joyce as being anti-heroic. And yet what we want to explore, I think, in this series is how much of their thinking about the freedom of the body and the connection of body and mind brings them together, not just as artists, I would say, but also as people who believed in what Yeats called the thinking of the body. It's true that Joyce and Ulysses divided chapters according to body parts, but in the great final soliloquy of Molly Bloom, everything is brought together, just as it is in so many of the poems and plays of Yeats. And I asked you to look at a short page by Yeats called The Thinking of the Body, in which he said, "Art bids us to taste and touch and hear and see the world, and shrinks from mere brain work." That the whole idea of thought is that it should also be a kind of physical experience, and vice versa. And this was the end, the abolition of a whole Victorian tradition of distinguishing mind and body, not just here in Ireland for historical reasons, it was a very strong distinction, but more generally in the world. So I'm delighted to talk to 2 expert exponents of dance, because we're going to talk a lot about dance in the next few weeks. But maybe I should turn first of all to Evanna, because I know the poem we've selected of Yeats, Song of Wandering Angus, is one to which you have danced in the production staged by Deirdre. Could you say something, Evanna, about how strange that kind of dance was compared with most forms you were familiar with?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Declan and Lisa, for the introduction. I mean, so yeah, we did, Deirdre's friend, you have to remind me the choreographer's name, Deirdre.
Megan Kennedy.
Megan, of course, yeah. She choreographed that dance in the film, and when I first did it, I was really surprised by so much of the movement is kind of sideways. It's done in profile, and that was of its time. It was influenced by all the drawings on the Greek urns, and there was this focus on the perfection, and you can kind of see it in those very famous pictures of Lucia, where everything is done in profile, and there's just a precision to it of creating these photographs, these beautiful portraits, these beautiful shapes. So yeah, when I first did that, was learning the dance, I had to slow down. It wasn't, you know, like a fast staccato dance. It was really about flowing and then getting to these shapes and really kind of letting your body sort of stretch into them. So yeah, it was a very different style of dance to anything I've done before, but
And you were really having to base it on still photos, weren't you?
Absolutely,
Rather than any moving item. Yeah,
still photos and the idea of the fish, because yeah, obviously in the photos you see these very distinct poses that were when we got to doing them and photographing them, it was like, it's actually quite hard to get your body into those shapes. But also, like, yeah, the idea of the fish, which is so evident in her costume. You know, if you look closely, it has the scales on it, and she cut off one of the legs of the costume, so it would look like it was a tail, you know. And so I think the dance, as well as creating those shapes, it had to have a flow to it, that there was a fish-like quality to it, this fluid movement of fish dancing and catching the light, and something that was kind of intangible and always moving. Yeah.
It's so interesting too, because many people in Connemara believe to this day that, you know, they're related to some of the fish or the mermaids under the water, or indeed that some who came onto the land changed their very nature in the process of doing so.
Right.
But that there's a kind of continuum out there between the humans and the fishes. Maybe you could remind us of the Yeats poem itself, Evanna, now, and we'll see that transformation, which of course is linked to what Lisa said. Because the landscape keeps changing with the changing light of the clouds, it's very easy for one thing to appear as another in Irish mythology. And this is just one example of many, which Evanna is going to read for us.
Great, yeah. So it's the Song of Wandering Angus by William Butler Yeats. I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she is gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
Thank you so much for both performances. I've loved this poem all my life, ever since I studied it for my intermediate certificate, Deirdre. But it had never struck me to link it to Joyce, and yet you've come up with this revolutionary interpretation.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Declan, and beautifully recited there, Evanna. I was pondering the photographs by Berenice Abbott of Lucia Joyce in that very magical, kind of mermaid costume, half human, half fish. And it obviously, thinking about the poem, it's very reminiscent of A Glimmering Girl. And I think that whole idea of transformation as well, you're talking about the sky, but also, as we know, that Joyce was very into the idea of transformation. Even I think, I often think of his wife's name, Barnacle, and goose barnacles. And if you know about goose barnacles, they're barnacles and they turn into birds and fly away in mythology. So I just kind of was intuiting a connection between Lucia's stance actually in those very important photographs, and just like we have very little traces of Lucia because all of her writing was destroyed, her diaries, all we have, it's very scant, and those photographs are really among the most important records that we have of her and of her her at the height of her dancing prowess.
I think she was knowingly invoking this poem when she dressed in the fish costume.
Yes, yes. So I in just the connection that I made as a dance historian, I was doing a lot of research on the Abbey Theatre ballets. And so the Abbey Theatre ballets were founded by W.B. Yeats and Ninette de Valois, who was another great Irish woman from Blessington, County Wicklow, who actually went on to found the British Ballet. So the Abbey Theatre Ballet existed from 1927 to 1933. And when I discovered Lucia Joyce, I just wondered, you know, could that have coincided? And exactly the dates coincide perfectly. And then we found, I found a letter mentioning Lucia Joyce, that W.B. Yeats mentioning Lucia Joyce as the greatest public dancer, and that he would like to use her one day in the Abbey Theatre Ballet. So this was a letter to his wife, George. So from there, you know, it's just like everything perfectly synchronizes. And then I noticed that when, you know, the Joyces would have known about the Abbey Theatre Ballet in Paris. And I noticed when W.B. Yeats won the Nobel Prize for Literature, they actually singled out the poem, The Song of Wandering Angus, and they said, "We liked especially your little silver trout." And in the Joyce household in Paris, despite that sort of animosity that you mentioned, Declan, you know, there was great reverence for Yeats's poetry, and they would recite it. And you know, I imagine reciting the Song of Wandering Angus. And you know, later in life, Joyce admitted that that Yeats was the greatest poet ever, and he would never be as good as him.
Well, he was right about that.
Yeah.
Evanna, what is there in the poem that you find particularly moving?
Gosh. I mean, just that, I suppose something about the girl, that she's otherworldly, and she has a life of her own, and that he's chasing after her. She just has so much life to her, and it does remind me of Lucia that way, where people were trying to pin her down, or, you know, assess her, even with her mental state and everything. It was trying to put a box on her and a label, and they never really could. They never really could agree on, you know, what was wrong with her, what was she. And even as an artist, you know, like, she was a dancer and she was an illustrator, and the fact that she, in this dance, she wasn't just the kind of artist who was an interpreter. She really created the whole scene, and the costume was important to her. So I just love that, yeah, that he's kind of chasing after her and pursuing her and trying to find out, trying to pin her down and understand her, and he never really gets that.
He creates a symbol which ultimately eludes his control.
Exactly.
Which is perhaps true of all things that inspire artists. They make them, but they can't be masters of them afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that, you know, it's written in most of the biographies that Lucia Joyce had mental illness and suffered from some form of madness, to put it in very crude terms. Do you think she was actually repressed because of this, if you like, denial of her art?
Yeah, definitely. I see, like, as someone who's an artist, like, I've struggled with mental health too, but I do find creativity as an outlet for that. I find it's a very, like, it's a strong energy, and it can be channeled inwards and become self-destructive, or it can be put into your external world, and, you know, things flourish. And I think Lucia's art was never really properly honored, because, I mean, several reasons. Like, her father was so established, and he was known as the artist in the family. And there's that great quote that Deirdre has in her article, where she angrily asserts, "C'est moi qui est l'artiste," I'm the artist here. And I think she always was trying to remind people of that she was an artist in her own right, but they always had to like sacrifice that, and she would try and set herself up and do things, but they were constantly moving around Paris or around Europe pursuing his art. And I think art, like, it's such a delicate thing, and artists are such sensitive people. The hardest thing is to have confidence in yourself enough to see these visions through. And she was quite an abstract, you know, she was in this avant-garde scene, so her art could be very easily dismissed as too crazy and too out there. And because she was a woman of that time, it wasn't seen, it wasn't revered as much as, say, James Joyce. And so I think probably at a certain point she just lost faith in herself, and nobody else was nurturing this dream for her. And yeah, I think it kind of, that it then turned into a more, it just kind of soured and turned in on herself. And yeah, I do see, and like dance is such a physical thing, like talking about the body, like there's so much wisdom and emotions that we store in our body that we get out. And so many people talked about her dancing, like she actually started dancing quite late, like when she was 14 or 15, and she wouldn't
that would be quite old to start ballet, wouldn't it?
Definitely. So she wouldn't have had as much refined technique, but everyone talked of this raw talent, and I think it was just this energy. And I do think that energy, when it's not honored and there isn't space held for it in art, it can be very damaging to your mental health. Yeah.
Of course, in the Yeats family too, there was a fear of madness and insanity that, you know, was linked obviously with genius. I mean, in the poem, the poet goes out to the wood because a fire was in my head. And you were saying how, you know, the fire is then externalized. He goes to blow the fire aflame, and it's as if he's trying to get control of this incredible moment of creativity that he has, but that also he's dicing with and may lose. Deirdre, do you think this connects with Lucia's struggle?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Declan. And actually, I was thinking about that today when I was kind of reading around the Carol Schloss's book. And believe it or not, one of the things that Lucia did when she was when she was in Bray in 1935, she went to visit her cousins in Bray. And this was her last bit of freedom, actually. And while she was there, by the way, she phoned Maud Gonne, which is pretty interesting to put that in that context. But one of the kind of, I suppose, in inverted commas, mad things that she did was she set a fire in the living room, in the middle of the living room. And she did this as well in the in one of the maison de santé that she was in. And but she said, you know, she was kind of referring to it as more symbolic, you know what the fire is, you know. And I was actually linking back with this poem, you know, and the idea of the fire in the head in this poem. Now, I do think that she, you know, she probably did have a breakdown, but you know, there was no reason for her to be locked up for over 45 years of her life, you know, because, like, you know, if people, you know, do have mental fragilities or issues, you know, it doesn't mean that they can't contribute and be part of society, you know. And as you were saying, there's that connection between creativity, you know, and it's a very well-known one, isn't it? You know, that creative people, you know, are often very fragile mentally. Look at Van Gogh, or, you know, and usually it's, you know, men get away with it. I mean, Samuel Beckett himself, who was a friend of Lucia's and very into dance, and he was at her performance of the Silverfish in Paris, and kept that photograph of her in that costume for his entire life, and actually was one of the few people to visit her as well. Yeah, sorry, I just lost my train of thought there.
Would go so far as to develop that idea and say that in modernism, in men it was genius, and in women it was often called madness. I'm thinking, for instance, of the fact that Carl Jung was asked to involve himself in the Joyce family case. And he said that the difference between James and Lucia, between the father and the daughter, was the difference between someone diving and someone drowning. Now, of course, you could say that's just another male not quite getting the truth of it. But
Yes.
is there any inkling of evidence for an analysis like that?
Yes, yes. I was also reading today that he described Ulysses as a transcendental tapeworm, which quite interesting.
He told Joyce that he knew more about women than the devil's grandmother, which was a left-handed compliment.
Yeah. So Lucia was with Young for 4 months in 1934, in fact. And I mean, what's interesting is that at the same time, Samuel Beckett was in psychoanalysis for his extreme depression in London, you know, and that kind of gets overlooked. You know, they all had issues, mental issues. So Young, it didn't work with Young. She wouldn't accept the transference from him, and she said it's that big, there's this big fat Swiss man trying to get hold of my soul. Diving and falling. I think that the physical expression of modern dance just didn't really compute, even for Young, you know, who you might think, you know, should be tuned into that. You know, if she wasn't expressing herself in the language that he was familiar with, and she wrote poetry, you know, and this was part of her analysis with Young, and unfortunately, the poet, we don't have the poetry, was destroyed, but James Joyce said that it was an anticipation of a new literature, and of course Young said it was a schizoid like Ulysses, and he said that she was an innovator and not yet understood, you know. And I think, you know, the physicality of her sensibility, you know, kind of having trained with people like Raymond Duncan and Elizabeth Duncan, who were these kind of, you know, very counterculture gurus who didn't wear conventional clothes, and, you know, everything was, experience was completely embodied and free, completely, really free, you know, in a way that even though we think of, you know, James and Nora as free, they actually were very conservative, you know, compared to the radical freedom that Lucia would have embodied. So it just, you know,
can I ask you both about that? It seems to me the freedom of the body is very important to these artists. And yet ballet is all about, in some ways, unfreedom. Some people have even called it body fascism. So is there a contradiction at the core of Yeats's project of bringing the Abbey, a theatre which prided the freedom of movement of the actors, the spontaneity compared with all the stylized acting in London, to set up a ballet school in such a context is rather strange, isn't it?
Interesting that you should mention that, because you know, the Lucia's training was very much in kind of Greek dancing and modern dancing, you know, with that kind of modern free aesthetic. But then when she was at the ripe old age of 22, she signed up for a very rigorous ballet training with Lyubov Ergova. It was a ballet russe feeder school in Paris. And incidentally, in modern dance, there's really no such thing as starting late. I mean, Mary Wigman, who was one of the inventors of Ausdruckstanz, she only started dance in her mid-20s, believe it or not. So, you know, but whereas in ballet, you can say that. So people thought that, you know, that was another sign of Lucia's madness, that she was signing up for ballet, extreme ballet classes at the age of 22. And also because Zelda Fitzgerald had, you know, been at the same school in Paris 2 years earlier. But in fact, I believe that she was really emulating Ninette de Valois, who danced with the Ballet Russe from 1923 to 1927. And if she was really seriously thinking about contributing at the Abbey Theatre Ballet, which was run by somebody who had performed with the Ballet Russe, it's really logical that she would sign up for classes, ballet, rigorous ballet classes, just to learn the form, I think. Yeah, so you're right. But like ballet and modern dance were always at loggerheads, actually.
I feel like her training, because she then, as you said, she went to do that ballet training. I think that might have knocked her confidence. Like, I don't remember the details exactly, but I believe she quit that training, and shortly after her dance career ended. But like, there is, I know, I feel that same way about ballet, and I didn't really like it when I was growing up because it felt really restrictive, and it felt there's obsession with the aesthetics and the lines they talk about, but anyone who doesn't have that training as a dancer kind of envies that background, because it's so rigorous. And like, anyone who wants to be a great dancer, you're looking for kind of total mastery of the body, and there's no other dance background I didn't find that gave you quite as much control over your body movement as ballet dancing. But yeah, Lucia kind of had started as like a modern dancer, which was so different. And then I think when she started getting attention and people were singling her out for her talent, then she felt, I think, this pressure to have the rigorous technical background. And yeah, but it didn't seem to suit her, because she quit shortly after.
Yeah, it was towards the end. But actually, what's interesting is, the deeper you go into it, like a lot of modern dance, like American modern dance, for example, the positions, it's all the classical ballet positions. So if you're talking about, like, even if any of you have heard of Yvonne Rainer and Trio A and postmodern dance, that is like the epitome of postmodern dance. But if you learn it, it's all the ballet positions first.
So it goes out the front door and comes in the back.
Absolutely, that's it. Yeah.
Should we break into our groups now, do you think?
Yes, I think we should, but thank you. That was a wonderful discussion. Ballet is fascism, Declan.
Well,
start with that question.
Michael Keegan-Dolan, who will be appearing later in the series, has predicted a time will come when many students of ballet will sue their teachers for bodily harm.
Well, if you look at their feet, like, it reminds me of the Japanese way of binding the feet back in the time. But let's break out into our breakout rooms now for about 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes. I'll invite you all to now introduce yourselves when you break out into the smaller groups. Perhaps share your location. And an exercise, if we have time for it, that we do it with our students is just maybe an interesting fact about yourself as an icebreaker. That's what we do with our students. If you want to give yourself that opportunity. And then Declan's also given us 2 questions to ponder during this session. One is if you can comment on Yeats's image of the silver apples of the moon in the poem and the golden apples of the sun. What do you think it means? And then the second question is, do you agree with Deirdre's theory that the fish dance by Lucia Joyce was in fact inspired by Yeats's poem? So once you've answered one of or two or both of those questions, or at least if you'd like to work together to come up with 1 or 2 questions that you'd like us to discuss post the breakout session, then please put it through the Google form that's shared in the chat function. Okay.
Or any other questions at all you'd like to ask about the discussion or about the poem.
And it might help to just appoint a lead in your group to facilitate it. Okay, so if there's one person the lead can be the alphabetical order, beginning or end. But if you just appoint, and then I guess the other is that we expect that we follow the rules of civil discourse in the groups, and that you will respect each other's comments. And please note, if you choose not to participate in the breakout rooms, then you can just stay in the main room, and you can just wait till we come back. Welcome back, and thank you for participating and staying with us. We actually had a very interesting conversation in our own breakout session. So we're going to launch right back into it because time is short. And my first question will go to Deirdre. And Deirdre, it's to do with the setting of your piece that we've all watched, and there's been a lot of compliments coming through on the piece and how much people enjoyed it. there's a parallel, I say, and I guess you shot it in a Georgian house, and I just would like to get a bit of more of a response from you about the setting in which you staged the dance, and why you chose Parnell Square, and is there remnants of Yeats's salon plays that he was very interested in having those sort of performances? If you can talk a bit about the setting.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so we shot the film. Well, basically, my thought process was looking at that image of Lucia Joyce, the photograph taken by Berenice Abbott, which was actually taken in her studio in Paris. So I was trying to replicate that space and imagine. So, like, if you think about like all we have, the residue of Lucia Joyce's dancing prowess are these photographs. So I was trying to imagine, what dance, that pose, that costume was part of. So, and then coincidentally, like very well spotted, coincidentally, W.B. Yeats had, his ideal spot for having his plays for dancers was in a living room, and he wanted it to be small and aristocratic. As he said, he only wanted 50 people to be there. And I know, believe it or not, where O'Connell House is on Merrion Square. Well, you may know that just a few doors down, that's where W.B. Yeats lived. And he actually did live there in the 1920s. And he did actually have some of his plays for dancers there in that space, in the Georgian setting. So we were lucky enough to be able to rehearse in O'Connell House, which was fantastic. And then for the shooting, because of the wooden floors, because we shot in Poetry Ireland, and then there was the fireplace, and actually, if you look very closely at Berenice Abbott's photographs, there is a fireplace, and she had some lights, old-fashioned lights, because she would have taken this photo on a large format camera. So we just populated the space like that. But I thought, like, when Lucia did this dance in the competition, it was actually a will-o'-the-wisp dance. That's how it was described in the review. And so Evanna really embodied that beautifully in the costume in that space, I thought.
So I have a follow-up question for that from Fritz. Thank you, Fritz. Do you have the music that Lucia would have originally danced to, or what would that have been?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Actually, the composer that was mentioned now in the review, so all we have is Charles Saint-Cyr's review of her performance at the Bal Boulier in 1929, and it sounds like she was chanting, because the reviewer mentioned her lilting chant, in which remained, Italian with a little residue of an Irish lilt, it said. And it was actually an English composer called something like a Dowdle. Oh, I knew I should have looked that up. But we actually used George Antheil. And George Antheil was known as the bad boy of American music. He was very much in the Joyce milieu in Paris. He brought them to the Ballet Suédois. He was working on a project to score an opera on the Cyclops episode of Ulysses, and he ended up composing the score for W.B. Yeats in one of his plays for dancers, Fighting the Waves in 1929. So, and actually, believe it or not, I just found a photograph by Berenice Abbott of George Antheil in the exact same room as the photos of Lucia. So, it kind of all, to me, is adding up to that well, I know that she was very influenced by him, by George Antheil and his type of kind of iconoclastic music. So yeah, and actually we use an excerpt of Ballet Mécanique by George Antheil, and then we had an original score by Conor Lenihan, who's a fabulous pianist and composer, inspired by Antheil.
Another follow-up question, Deirdre, for you. In the recent session, this is from Catherine, in discussing Lucia's creativity and her mental health issues, you said that men got away with it. Do you think this was because of a focus on women's mental health by figures such as Charcot and Freud?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, like Paul Claudel was also in that milieu. He also wrote librettos for the Ballet Suédois, which the Joyces went to, and they were all immersed in this. The Ballet Suédois were like the Ballet Russe, another Ballet Russe. So Paul Claudel's sister, you might have heard of her, the sculptor Camille Claudel, who famously was a fabulous sculptor, very well known for her relationship with Rodin, Auguste Rodin, and she was incarcerated as well. Curiously enough, Giorgio's wife, Giorgio Joyce, also his wife was incarcerated in a mental asylum eventually. So it happened a lot in those circles, and also in those circles of surrounding like the Guggenheims, and that women seemed to just go for a rest to Maison de Santé. It was kind of chic at the time as well, whereas, as we know, like men, like as I meant, nobody ever talks about the fact that Samuel Beckett suffered from severe depression and was in psychoanalysis for years. You know what I mean? Like, that's the way it should be for both genders, I think.
The problem Beckett had was that he couldn't sufficiently distance himself from his mother, and she sent him to London for sessions with Jung, but because she paid for them, they were self-defeating.
I have a question for Evanna. Evanna, this is a kind of correlation between 1920s Paris, during which time Lucia Joyce was a young woman, and it seems that 1920s was a time of change. And now modern, there's in the modern world, Evanna, there's like a dark side of technology and social media now that kind of has revolutionized our world. Yet beneath the kind of gloss of Instagram and Facebook, there seems to lurk a darker kind of side that might be echoing of 1920s Paris. I'm just wondering if you can comment about how we might struggle in similar ways to these kind of new ways of behaving.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think that, because sometimes I do look back on, the 20s and Lucia's time, that time in Paris, like, so many artists were thriving, but it wasn't, the women were still, held back. And you see that in the way James Joyce and Lucia Joyce's careers were, their art forms were treated so differently. I think women are still struggling to get, to be seen not as just mad, like, artistic women, to be given that permission to explore these things. And I don't know, I mean, I don't know really how it relates to social media, but well, yeah, I suppose we're exploring with that. We're testing how much we can put ourselves out there, how much we can share of ourselves and still be taken seriously. I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that. It's a big question, but maybe.
Oh, I guess I read it as more of like a like the Me Too movement, and you've seen this kind of feminist, I guess, awakening or being woke to the kind of way. And I think I wonder if it correlates is how I read it.
Yeah, I do think like if Lucia was born now, she didn't have the language to talk about mental health. Like now people do talk about it as being on a spectrum, and it doesn't mean you're mad. It just means it's part of everyone's life. Everyone has to manage it, whether you see it or not. And I think back then it was like embarrassing and shameful and hushed up. And now we have so much more tools to discuss it. We have more examples of people managing it, having a career and managing it, and people, like that's the thing. I think it's been funny, like, you know, there's been all this talk about art and freedom of speech and how much we can share, and it's funny how people they look to artists and want them to be perfect and want them to not express controversial views, but artists, like, that's the whole point. They're not politicians, they're not activists. They're supposed to show up both sides of human nature, you know, like the light and the shade, and that's the kind of the safe space to explore the shadow side of yourself. And I think it's brilliant that that artists have that. And I think Lucia completely had that, but as I said, didn't have this place to freely express it in her art, and then didn't have the words to explain it herself in those circles. I mean, you know, part of her treatment, she had so many strange things happen to her. She was injected with bovine serum and put in straitjackets, and it's like that wasn't helpful exactly. And I think if she was a woman of today, she'd have much more space to actually talk about the balance between art and mental health.
She lived into the 1980s, and a friend of mine visited her in the mental hospital she was in Northampton, and she was absolutely fine. And the hospital authorities said to her, you know, you're completely well. You could leave any day now you wanted. But she had become so attached to the institution that she didn't. And that's really part of the sadness, I think, of all that story. You know, that she was free to go, but she had no other home.
So we only have a couple minutes, but Declan, one question for you. Richard Ellman as the biographer, and there's just, if you could comment towards why Stephen Joyce had such a kind of vehemence to excise all the material about Lucia Joyce, just to comment about that as to, and I believe that Joyce spoke to Ellman and wanted to get the material in his own biography taken away or omitted. I wonder if you can comment to that.
Well, I think that Stephen Joyce, quite understandably, was defensive of his family's pride. And he may have shared Deirdre and Evanna's view that Lucia was not schizophrenic or mad. And he may have regarded it as a bit of a libel on the family that people were suggesting she might have been. And I mentioned already that there were people in the Yeats family who, you know, had similar fears of being traduced, even by those who were interested in the artistic products of that very gifted family. Because as we've agreed, you know, let's say mental creativity and a certain admirable instability can go together. But in those times, it wasn't so much recognized. I think Stephen was quite suspicious of academic interventions in the Joyce debate. But there were books he admired and people he admired. Sean O'Morga was the producer who went to talk with Lucia in the 1980s, whom I just mentioned. And Stephen and he were very friendly. So I think, you know, although people gave Stephen Joyce the reputation of being a kind of village complainer, as someone said, he was actively pursuing friendships with Joyceans he approved of too.
Okay, I know I'm going a little bit over, but I'm going to do one more because Kate Shirley from Luxembourg has responded to one of the questions, and I'd like to recite it here, and maybe Declan, if you or the panel like to comment. In the poem, I was most immediately struck by the repetition of "called me by my name." Other than simply metrical reasons, why do you think this repetition occurs? Yeats tends to use repetition sparingly, but deliberately.
There is an incantatory quality to repetition, and it's a tease, because she called me by my name and ran. She's kind of inviting him and at the same time disabling him. And the whole thing of the silver apples is to do with the fact that Yeats first saw Maud under an apple blossom. but there's a sense in which even as she's beckoning him, she's dismissing him. And I think that's what that line means. Call me by my name. That sounds intimate, doesn't it? And ran. That sounds like you want distance.
That's like, if I could just make a comment there, that is very much like the will-o'-the-wisp, which is, the will-o'-the-wisp, the girl who kind of disappears. And that was in the review of Lucia's Dance in 1929. So that's another synergy between Lucia and the poem. It just seems to sit perfectly, I think.
Well, it is unfortunate, but we have come to that time. I want to reiterate my sincerest thanks to Deirdre and to Evanna for joining us, and of course for Declan for shepherding this wonderful series with us for the next 4 weeks. If you did not have the opportunity to watch Deirdre's film, I strongly encourage you to go back to Think Indie's website to look at it. We only have it up for a limited time, so it'll only be up there for the next couple of days. So please take advantage of this opportunity to see Evanna dance. And then I'd encourage you to go to the part 2 now. It's up on and available on ThinkND for the next series of lectures. And just remember to share the series. It's open and free to all who'd like to join. And I want to encourage you all to engage on our LinkedIn profile if we did not get to your questions. And we will be releasing a podcast, and we will include the discussion that we had in our room about Irish dance and ballet. I think it was a great discussion, so we will include that in the podcast. So more to come for you. So in the meantime, stay well and be safe, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Bye.